So the US economy just took another blow. Well, what can we say? Investors around the world just don't believe Trump anymore. While he claims to bring back the golden age of America, all his actions points is to a collapsing economy and the markets are also tanking. Everything is simply going wrong and Trump's getting worse on social media by the minute. The US doesn't have free trade. The entire world is ripping us off, and that's what he just wrote. It tells us how unstable the White House has gotten. Trump trying to double his tariffs on Canada is but the start of the chaos. Things will only ratchet up in the weeks and the days ahead. The 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada plus 20% on China is only the start. The plan is simple: de-industrialize the world and force manufacturing back to the US. And by now, we should be under no illusions that Trump is joking. We have a litany of trade punishments coming from the US in April, and just these two are enough to break apart the global economy and invite total retaliation on the United States. In April, Trump will unleash a 25% across the board tariff on the EU, which is the third biggest economy in the world. This could collapse European exports to the US by 70%. EU GDP could also collapse by 1.5%, which is enough to send almost every member state into recession. And when Europe enters one, global consumption will get hammered as well. We also have a 25% tariff coming for cars and semiconductors. The biggest losers will be US allies, including South Korea and Japan. Samsung, Honda, and Tokyo Electron, they will all be reeling. Their high value exports are about to get clobbered, and this destabilizes the global economy even further and really sets up the US to face a world of pain. Not only will US taxpayers face high inflation, input costs into US factories will also rise. And how is this good for the economy? It drives consumption down and it's horrible for earnings. And that's why Citigroup just gave the US markets a slap to the face. The US bank has decided to downgrade US stocks, and guess who got an upgrade? It's China. It's really ironic because China is supposed to be collapsing and US assets are supposed to be safe haven assets, right? We definitely have chaos today, but money is leaving US markets. This is most definitely making Trump hot mad. As money flows away, this spells trouble for the US. This is one economy that needs a constant flow of capital coming in to sustain itself. For the last 2 decades, we heard the same narrative: buy the S&P and sit on it. US exceptionalism will never end and there's nowhere else to put your money in. And here's one that I keep hearing: why would you invest in the companies of a communist country? Well, the numbers simply don't lie. From January 2025 to now, Chinese stocks have appreciated by over 25%. Meanwhile, US stocks have underperformed. It's actually down more than 5% today as of this recording. It's a big reversal of fortunes and it really signals a systemic shift of capital from the United States away to China. Which is funny because China should have collapsed 10 years ago. Aren't all their buildings made of tofu? But let's understand why this is happening. The US still holds the reserve currency of the world, but there's a reason why money just isn't flowing into US equities. At the end of the day, stock prices are driven by earnings and sentiment. Both are working against the United States. While Trump is trying to rein in the deficits and cut spending, Beijing is beginning to launch the mother of all stimulus in 2025, as stock prices are trying to front run that move. Now, this chart is very important. You might want to save this as your screensaver. During Trump's first term, we had the first trade war imposed on China. He imposed brutal tariffs on steel and aluminum on Chinese imports. In response to this, Beijing started to stimulate their economy. By 2019, the stimulus went into overdrive. China told their banks to lend more and cut reserve requirements to boost liquidity. They also cut VAT tax for manufacturers and they borrowed a ton of money for government projects. Now in 2021, China then popped their own property bubble and stocks collapsed. And now we are seeing China restart their stimulus engine in this season of The Apprentice. But this time it might not be temporary. China is now moving to build up their domestic consumption. So this could be a lasting tailwind. The more Trump tries to corner China, the more China will be forced to protect their own economy. Unlike the US, China actually has the fiscal room to do it. Their interest rates are some of the lowest in the world. Their 10-year yield is less than 1.5%, while the US is well above 4%. It's a big world of difference. And where money flows, investors flock to that destination. Just like how the US printed a ton of money in '08 and 2020 that attracted a ton of money into American stocks. But things are now very different. There's a reason why Citi is upgrading their view on China to overweight from neutral, while cutting the rating down for US stocks. Trump is doing all he can to crush the US economy. The tariff war is one great example, but even domestically, not all is well. Under Elon Musk, Doge has cut away a ton of federal workers so far, and when people lose their jobs, obviously they don't have an income to spend. And just put two and two together, you get a collapse in US company earnings. So far, Musk has cut over 32,000 federal workers. Now, the bulk of those are probationary employees and agencies earmarked for dismantling, and that includes USAID and the Education Department as well. Now, I'm not here to judge if it's right or wrong, but the effects are undeniable on the US economy. Spending is going to come crashing down the more jobs Elon continues to slash.
Because we are draining the swamp. It's very simple. And the days of rule by unelected bureaucrats are over.
Now, draining the swamp sounds nice. I'm sure there's a ton of wasteful spending in the United States, and cutting down the federal deficit is important. However, you are cutting spending in the real economy as well. Even today, the US stock market is still being propped up by a ton of deficit spending. From October through February this year, the US deficit hit a record $1.15 trillion. Last year, during the same period, the deficit was only $830 billion, which means there's going to be a lot more cuts needed if Trump is really serious about bringing in the deficits, bringing them under control. Meanwhile, China is moving to unleash even more money to boost domestic demand. Beijing will ramp up fiscal stimulus, allowing the broad deficit to hit 10% of GDP. Now, this is a huge amount of money, and as we said earlier, China can afford it because their cost of borrowing is extremely cheap. They can lock in 1.5% for the next 10 years. And to make this happen, they are issuing a tsunami of bonds, 1.3 trillion of ultra-long bonds, 500 billion yuan of sovereign debt for their banking sector to get them to lend more, and 4.4 trillion for local Chinese governments. The total amount of bond issuance could reach nearly 12 trillion RMB. That's around 1.6 trillion US dollars this year. And this is what investors want: more liquidity in the system to boost company earnings. And this money will be going to make the Chinese economy more resilient against US tariffs and US sanctions, which means there will be a lasting effect. Even if Trump ramps up the pain, China can rely on their own local consumers to sustain and grow the economy. That's the big difference this time. Now, the next reason for the US downgrade comes from the trade war raging on right now. Because of that, the world economy is turning against the US. Now, there's a reason why Citi has declared US exceptionalism is pausing for the coming few months. In other words, US stocks could continue to crash for the next few months. The safe haven trade, money flowing into America, could be broken, at least for now. By waging a brutal trade war, Trump is already turning countries against US brands. Many consumers in Canada are already boycotting US goods in retaliation. And once again, the White House just reiterated the agenda of the tariffs is to punish the world and keep escalating if any country tries to resist.
We are finally going to treat nations the way that they have treated the United States for far too long. And Canada saw, if you want to step up into the big leagues with President Trump, you better be prepared to play. It looks like they are not, because the Ontario Premier already dropped his 25% tariff on electricity after having a bold threat to shut off electricity for the American people. President Trump said absolutely not. He did what is right. He stood by the American people, and his tariff policy is working. It's going to make America wealthy again. It's going to bring jobs back home. And to every investor around the world, if you come to the United States and do business, you will face no tariffs. You will have the lowest taxes on the planet, and that's how we're going to make America strong and wealthy again.
Now, it's crazy, but it's happening. We are in twilight zone economics. In order to reshore production back to the US, Trump is willing to deindustrialize global competitors. And when you weaponize the US consumer market, the world will push back. How is that good for business earnings? It's not. And that's why US stocks are being downgraded. Take US imports of Canadian aluminum for example, they are heavily reliant on it. 75% of total US imports of the metal comes from up north. That's 2.7 million tons bought at a discount from a preferred supplier. It is also supporting 700,000 jobs in the United States. By slapping a tariff, Donald Trump is punishing the majority of supply coming into his economy. This is 60% of the entire US annual consumption. How are prices not going to go up? Yes, local metal producers in the US will be jumping for joy, but consumers and households will get punished. And just based on the data alone, the outcome is unambiguous. It's a horror show for inflation, for people's budgets, and for the economy at large. But let's hammer in the point a little further. How widespread is the use of aluminum in the US economy? And I assure you, it's much more than just making soft drink cans and food packaging. Transport accounts for over a third of US aluminum consumption. To make your Ford, GM, and Tesla cars, you'll need a ton of the metal. Packaging accounts for only 23%. The remaining 40% of use comes from building, electrical, machinery, and consumer based industries. Basically, the entire US supply chain is affected. As a consumer, you'll be facing higher prices, and if the heat stays long enough, you will consume less. And for investors, it's not hard to see what this will lead to. Company earnings on the aggregate will fall. Now, this is based on just one single tariff. This video will be hours long if we were to go one by one. Suddenly, the US market doesn't look that attractive, does it? So I'm not surprised that Citi decided to downgrade US stocks. They were overvalued to begin with, and Trump has decided to pop the bubble. Now, will Trump do a U-turn and save the US markets? I don't think so. He seems keen to go pedal to the metal. This might not end until either the US economy or the world breaks. And just within the steel industry itself, US steelmakers like Nucor are telling Trump to stay the course, not to roll back the tariffs or foreign imports will come surging in. And if that happens, prices will drop and their profits will collapse. So even within the US economy itself, there are big powerful interests that wants the trade war to continue. The stock market is a forward-looking mechanism. Now the big correction we are seeing right now is not just a repricing exercise. This could be the start of money flowing from the west to the east. China being upgraded also isn't an accident. And the longer Trump continues this, the more real this will become. But let me know what you think. Is there an off-ramp to the tariff war? And will US stocks continue to fall apart? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.